From a bronze bull that bellowed and screamed to an ingenious use for rats, these Dark Age punishments were utterly horrifying. Up first is the breaking wheel. One of the most famous and varied types of punishment in the Middle Ages was the breaking wheel. Essentially a wagon wheel, victims would be bound to it before having a series of punishments enacted. Sometimes hammers would be taken to all their limbs, or ropes would twist them about the wheel. This was sometimes then followed by the wheel being rolled down a rocky hill, covered in thorns and spikes. Usually this was a definitive end for the punished, but punishers would also sometimes mount the wheel as if on a long axle and raise the victim into the sky. There are even accounts of entire forests of breaking wheels raised to the sky after particularly horrendous mass punishings. In some cases, fire was used to turn them into towering torches, and in other cases they were simply left in the sky for the birds to pick at. Next is the rack. The rack is a classic medieval device as synonymous with the brutality of the Dark Ages as the plague or steppe nomads. The rack is, well, a rack with winches at either end. The victim is laid down on the rack and has their hands and feet bound to the winches, and the mechanism is then twisted, slowly and painfully stretching whatever is on it. This is, it should go without saying, insanely painful and damaging. I won't go into grave detail, but this device would essentially separate every internal connection. This device was also used for a significant period in history, so much so that it even appears in Greek myth, with Procrustes using a rack to attempt to stretch Theseus before the crusty pro meets his end. Next is LINGCHI. Ancient China had a very strict and codified system of punishments and judicial harm. They were all horrifying in their own way, meant to destroy one's sense of self and social connections just as much as their body. But LINGCHI is perhaps one of the most simple and outright vicious. Also known as 1,000 slices, the victim would be immobilized and then slowly carved. Experienced punishers would even pride themselves on how many incisions they could make before the punished perished. LINGCHI was reserved only for those who committed high treason or crimes against their family. In Confucianism, the state and the family were considered one and the same, and crimes against the order of the family, say a daughter disobeying or betraying her father, would be treated just as harshly as treason against the state. Essentially believing that degeneracy in the family would then spread to the state and cause the collapse of civilization, and that a well-regulated and controlled family meant a well-regulated and controlled state. Next is the Brazen Bull. Another of the most famous punishments in history, the Brazen Bull was actually allegedly first tested on its creator. Essentially a hollow bronze bull with musical pipes in its head, a person would be put inside and a fire lit underneath. Then the king could revel and laugh as the cries from inside were converted into cow-like moos by the pipes. The original bull was created by Perolaus for King Phalaris, but King Phalaris tricked Perolaus into going inside the bull before locking him in and beginning the fire. Ironically enough, Phalaris would also perish within the bronze bull after being overthrown by Telemachus. Next are rats. Unlike other techniques or tools which are known from a specific era and time period, rat punishment seems to have been invented whenever and wherever there were rats, which is basically everywhere. It takes advantage of a rat's natural desire to live, along with the innate horror of being consumed alive by another creature. Essentially, a rat in a bucket would be tied down over the victim's body, and then hot coals would be placed onto the bucket. As the heat increased, the rat would begin scrabbling, scratching, and chewing its way away from the heat. I'll let you imagine just how that would work. Next is Vesta burial. For the vestigial virgins of Vesta, the most important thing in their lives was holding true to their oaths and tending the sacred fire. Much like Irish monks centuries later, these women, and the culture around them, believed their chastity and devotion staved off apocalypse and devastation through the worship of the gods. So breaking those vows was considered not only shameful, but also potentially world-ending. These women, some of whom may not have chosen to break their vows at all, would be marched under great ceremony to the Campus Sceleratus, or Field of Evil, which had many underground chambers. These women would then be entombed in these subterranean chambers which were never cleaned between occupants. The entire ceremony around the punishment was considered critical to ensuring the happiness of the gods and for for the atonement of sins. More likely, however, the ceremony served as a useful way of ensuring everyone in the city saw this horrible condemnation. The Judas cradle. Invented in ancient Rome and carried throughout the Middle Ages, the Judas cradle is one of the most feared implements of medieval history. The cradle was made up of two parts. The first is the cradle, a system of ropes and pulleys that allowed an entire person to be hoisted into the air and moved around without too much harm. The second part was the seat, a pyramid usually tipped with sharp and pointy angular metal. The point of this pyramid would be lined up with the Punisher's opening of choice, and the cradle would be slowly lowered down, causing excruciating pain. While the modern version may seem like a bit of spicy fun, this device was utterly reviled and hated for the several centuries of its use. Of course, the issue with punishment for information, which the Judas cradle was designed for, is that most people will tell you just about anything you could ever want to hear just to make sure they don't have to face such a horrible fate, which means that any confessions gathered are likely entirely useless. Hanging has been one of the most popular ways to punish criminals for thousands of years, but it isn't as simple as some people think. It's a hard science. Now, you can just hoist someone by their neck and leave them, but that's kind of unsettling to watch and takes a really, really long time to work, like sometimes days. So the other option is a short drop with a trapdoor that severs the spinal cord and makes for a quick and clean end. The upright jerker is sort of like that, except in reverse. Instead of dropping the person, the rope is, well, jerked, ideally leading to a clean and immediate snap. As long as you don't, put too much weight on the rope and turn the prisoner's spine into an impromptu jack-in-the-box. Next is scaphism. Perhaps the worst punishment I've literally ever heard of, scaphism involved sealing someone's body inside of a tree trunk, feeding them a rich diet of honey and milk, slathering them in honey and feces, and then leaving them in a river to rot. The diet of honey and milk would pass through their body fairly quickly filling up the tree trunk they were in and encouraging all sorts of incredibly, horrifically nasty diseases to fester and propagate. Not to mention all the bugs and flies. Next is the elephant. This is a simple but effective and brutal way of ending a prisoner. Elephants are really big and really heavy, and also fairly easy to train, so it didn't take that long for someone who had an issue with someone else to look at their elephant and back at the problem and come up with an idea on how to combine the two. It was most popular in medieval India and China, where the elephants would be trained to take small steps, walking up the person from ankles to head, which, according to eyewitnesses, made the bodies behave a little like a toothpaste tube getting run over by a monster truck. Yikes. Those were gruesome ways prisoners were punished in the Dark Ages. I hope you enjoyed more than I did, and I'll see you next time. Alright. From a bronze bull that bellowed and screamed to an ingenious use for rats left in the sky for the birds to pick at. Next is the rack. The rack is a classic medieval internal connection. This device was also used when Krusty Pro meets his end. Next is LINGCHI.